The rain in Millbrook County didn't fall so much as it seeped, a slow gray drizzle that had been going on for 3 days straight, turning the gravel lot behind Denny's Diner into a shallow lake of mud and oil-slicked puddles. Sarah Whitfield stood at the bus stop beneath a cracked plastic shelter, her waitress apron still tied around her waist because she hadn't had time to take it off, and watched the 7:42 bus pull away without stopping. The driver had seen her. She knew he had seen her, the way his eyes flicked toward the shelter and then away, the way the bus accelerated a half-second too fast through the puddle at the curb, sending a wave of gray water across her sneakers and the hem of her jeans. She didn't cry. She had stopped letting herself cry in public 2 years ago, right around the time she realized that tears didn't fix broken transmissions or empty refrigerators, and that the only thing they were good for was making other people uncomfortable enough to look away faster. She had $11 in her pocket. She had 2 sons waiting for her in a Motel 6 room on Route 9, the kind of room where the heater rattled like it was full of loose teeth and the carpet held a smell that never quite left no matter how many candles she burned. She had a phone with a cracked screen and 4% battery, and on that screen, unanswered, was a text from her landlord that simply read, "Locks changed. Your things are in the dumpster behind the building. Don't come back." That had been 6 days ago. 6 days since a sheriff's deputy stood on the sagging porch of the only home her boys had ever known and read the eviction notice aloud in a voice that was almost kind, while 11-year-old Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching a backpack with one strap broken, and 7-year-old Eli cried without understanding why. Only that his mother's face had gone the color of ash and that something in the world had cracked open beneath their feet. Sarah had worked 2 jobs for 4 years. She had picked up double shifts on Christmas Eve. She had sold her wedding ring, the one that had meant something once, before David decided fatherhood was a burden he'd rather set down than carry, for $400 that had gone straight into a medical bill for Eli's asthma. She had done everything right, or at least everything she knew how to do right, and it hadn't been enough. It was never quite enough. That was the particular cruelty of being poor in America. Not that you didn't work hard, but that hard work was treated like a virtue instead of a currency, and virtues didn't pay rent. She walked the mile and a half back to the motel in the rain because she didn't have another $11 to waste on a cab, and by the time she pushed open the door to room 114, her sons were sitting cross-legged on one of the 2 double beds, sharing a bag of gas station pretzels for dinner, watching a cartoon with the sound turned low so as not to bother the neighbors. "Mama," Eli said, looking up with the particular hope that only a 7-year-old can still manage after everything. "Did you bring home pie?" Some nights, when a customer left a decent tip, she did bring home pie. A single slice wrapped in a napkin, split 3 ways, eaten with plastic forks while they sat on motel beds pretending it was a celebration of something. Tonight she had $11 and a strained ankle from walking in wet sneakers, and she had to look her son in the eye and shake her head. "Not tonight, baby. Tomorrow, maybe." Marcus, who was old enough now to understand what maybe really meant, didn't say anything. He just scooted closer to his little brother and offered him the last of the pretzels, the way he always did, the way he'd been doing since he was too young to have to do it at all. Sarah sat down on the edge of the other bed, peeled off her wet shoes, and let herself feel, for exactly 90 seconds, because that was all she could afford, the full weight of how tired she was. Not tired like a bad day. Tired like a bone-deep exhaustion that came from 4 years of running just to stay in place, of smiling at customers who called her sweetheart while stiffing her on tips, of doing math in her head every single day of her life. Rent minus paycheck, minus gas, minus the boy's shoes that never seemed to stop growing, minus, until there was nothing left to subtract and the number was already negative before the month even started. Her phone buzzed. 3% battery now. An unknown number, area code she didn't recognize, something out of state. She almost didn't answer it. In her experience, unknown numbers meant collection agencies, or worse, another version of bad news dressed up in the sterile language of institutions. But something, call it exhaustion, call it a splinter of reckless hope she thought she'd lost years ago, made her thumb slide across the screen. "Hello. Is this Sarah Whitfield?" Formerly Sarah Calloway. Her chest tightened at the sound of her maiden name. Nobody had called her that in over a decade. Yes. Who is this? My name is Gerald Thorne. I'm an attorney with Thorne and Aldis, out of Asheville, North Carolina. I've been trying to locate you for several weeks now, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm calling regarding the estate of your late great-aunt, Margaret Calloway. Sarah blinked. She could count on one hand the number of times she'd heard the name Margaret Calloway in her life. A distant relative, some elderly woman on her father's side, she'd met perhaps twice as a child, at a funeral and a wedding, decades apart, a stern face and a house that smelled like cedar and old paper. I barely knew her. I don't understand. Mrs. Calloway passed away 6 weeks ago, the lawyer said, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of a man who delivered this kind of news for a living. She had no children, and after her husband's passing 30 years ago, she never remarried. You are, as it turns out, her closest living blood relative. She has named you as sole heir to her estate. Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite herself, a small, dangerous ember of hope flickering to life in her chest. A feeling she immediately distrusted, because hope, in her experience, was usually just disappointment that hadn't arrived yet. Her estate, she repeated carefully. What does that mean exactly? It means, Mrs. Whitfield, the lawyer said, that you are now the owner of a property known locally as Calloway Manor. Approximately 11 acres, a main house of some historical note, situated outside the town of Hollow Creek, North Carolina. 11 acres. A house. Historical note. For one wild, unguarded second, Sarah let herself imagine it. A real house, a yard, bedrooms with doors that locked, a kitchen where she could cook something other than gas station food, a place where her sons could finally stop feeling like guests in their own lives. I should tell you, the lawyer added, and something in his tone shifted, grew more careful, that the property has been unoccupied for approximately 15 years. It is, by all accounts, in a state of significant disrepair. I don't want to give you false expectations. Several buyers have expressed interest in purchasing the land, for the acreage alone, mostly, but the house itself. He paused. The house itself may be worth very little, possibly nothing at all. And there it was. The subtraction, right on schedule. Still, something worth nothing was still something. It was more than $11 in a Motel 6 room with a rattling heater. It was, at the very least, a roof, however broken that roof might be. I'll take it, Sarah said, before she'd even fully decided to say it. Whatever's there. I'll take it. She hung up the phone just as the screen flashed its final warning and went dark, the battery finally dying. And she sat there in the humming quiet of the motel room with her sons watching cartoons behind her, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not happiness exactly. Something more fragile than that. The dangerous, electric feeling of a door creaking open in a wall she had believed, for years, was solid. They arrived in Hollow Creek 4 days later, in a rented U-Haul that held the sum total of what remained of their lives. 2 suitcases, a box of the boys' schoolwork, and a second-hand mattress Sarah had bought with the last of her savings because she refused to let her son sleep on a bare floor if she could help it. Hollow Creek was the kind of small southern town that looked, at first glance, like a postcard from another decade. A main street with brick storefronts and hand-painted signs, a white clapboard church with a steeple that caught the afternoon light, a diner with a hand-lettered special written in chalk on a sandwich board out front. It had the quiet, watchful stillness of a place where everybody knew everybody, and strangers were noticed the moment their tires hit the town line. Sarah felt eyes on the U-Haul as she drove through, not hostile exactly, but curious in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. An older man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store straightened up and watched them pass, with an expression she couldn't quite read. A woman on the church steps paused mid-sentence, her hand rising halfway to point before she caught herself. "Mama, why's everyone looking at us?" Marcus asked from the passenger seat, his voice low, the way it got when he was trying not to alarm his little brother in the back. "Small towns," Sarah said, keeping her voice light. "Everybody's just curious about new faces, that's all." But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The directions the lawyer had given her took them out past the edge of town, down a two-lane road that narrowed and narrowed until the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a long dirt drive swallowed on both sides by overgrown oaks whose branches knitted together overhead like the ribs of some enormous, sleeping creature. The U-Haul bounced and rattled over ruts that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years, and Sarah gripped the wheel tighter with every passing minute, that fragile ember of hope in her chest starting, despite her best efforts, to gutter. And then the trees broke open, and she saw it for the first time. Callaway Manor. It rose up out of the overgrown field like something out of a half-remembered dream. A great, sprawling Victorian structure of dark stone and weathered timber, 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch that sagged dangerously in places and a widow's walk crowning the roof like a broken tiara. Ivy had claimed one entire wing of the house, crawling up the walls and through shattered windows, and the front door hung slightly ajar on a single working hinge, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally come home. Marcus let out a low whistle. That's ours. That's ours, Sarah said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Eli, pressing his face to the window, said nothing at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd screamed. Up close, the disappointment set in fast and hard. The porch steps were rotted through in places, black with old water damage. Several of the upper windows were broken, gaping like missing teeth. The chimney had partially collapsed at some point, scattering brick across an overgrown flower bed that might once, decades ago, have been beautiful. A for sale sign, faded and peeling, lay face down in the weeds near the drive, as if even the real estate agents had eventually given up. This was not the house Sarah had allowed herself to imagine on the phone that night. This was not salvation. This was a ruin, beautiful, in the sad, haunted way that ruins sometimes were, but a ruin all the same. She stood at the base of the crumbling steps for a long moment, her sons flanking her, all 3 of them staring up at the dark windows of a house that seemed, in that late afternoon light, to be staring right back. "Mama," Eli whispered, slipping his small hand into hers. "Is it haunted?" Sarah almost laughed, a short, exhausted sound with no real humor in it. "No, baby. It's just old. Just needs some love, that's all." But even as she said it, gazing up at the dark, empty windows, the broken widow's walk silhouetted against the graying sky, she felt an unmistakable prickle crawl up the back of her neck, the distinct, irrational sensation of being watched by something that had been waiting a very long time. She pushed the feeling down, squared her shoulders, and led her sons up the rotting steps toward the front door. Whatever waited inside, it was theirs now, for better or worse. The door groaned open on its single hinge with a sound like something exhaling after a long, long sleep. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the particular mustiness of a house that had been sealed away from the world for 15 years, a smell of old wood, mildew, and something underneath it Sarah couldn't quite name, something almost sweet, like dried flowers left too long in a vase. Sunlight filtered weakly through grimy windows, illuminating slow drifting motes of dust that seemed to hang suspended in the stillness, as if time itself moved slower inside these walls. The front hall stretched before them, high-ceilinged and grand in the way only old houses could be, with a wide staircase curving up into shadow and a chandelier overhead so thick with cobwebs it looked like something spun by a spider the size of a dog. Wallpaper peeled in long curling strips from the walls, revealing water-stained plaster beneath. A grandfather clock stood silent and stopped in the corner, its hands frozen at 4:17. Though whether that was 4:17 in the afternoon or the morning, and on what day, 15 years ago, no one could say. "It's so quiet," Marcus murmured. His voice hushed the way people's voices went hushed in libraries, or churches, or places that seemed to demand a certain reverence. Sarah flicked the light switch by the door out of pure habit, not expecting anything, and was startled when, after a brief flicker, one dim bulb in the hallway sputtered weakly to life. Someone, at some point, had kept the electricity connected, even for a house no one lived in. She filed that thought away, small and strange, alongside all the others. They moved room to room, footsteps echoing on warped hardwood floors, and with every doorway, the house revealed another layer of its slow decay. A parlor with furniture draped in yellowed sheets, like a room full of ghosts caught mid-haunt. A dining room with a table long enough to seat 12, its surface buried under a fine gray film of dust. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of the books swollen and warped from some long-ago leak, their spines illegible. And yet, beneath the decay, Sarah kept catching glimpses of something else. The bones of real craftsmanship. Hand-carved moldings along the ceiling. A fireplace mantel carved with intricate vines and flowers. Clearly the work of someone who had cared, once, about beauty for its own sake. Stained glass in a hallway window that, when the light hit it right, threw fractured jewels of red and gold across the dusty floor. This house had been loved once. That much was clear. Loved, and then, for reasons Sarah didn't yet understand, abandoned entirely. It was Eli who found the first strange thing. He had wandered a few steps ahead of them into what looked like it had once been a sitting room, and when Sarah caught up, she found him standing very still in the center of the room, staring at the wall above the cold, empty fireplace. "Mama," he said, his voice small. "Somebody's crying." Sarah froze. "What baby?" "I heard it. Just now. Somebody crying. Real quiet. Like from inside the wall." Marcus rolled his eyes in the particular way of an older brother trying to seem braver than he felt. "It's an old house, Eli. Old houses make noises. It's probably just pipes or something." But Sarah had gone very still, listening, and for one suspended moment, she thought she heard it too. A faint, thin sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, there and then gone, like a sound heard underwater or in the last seconds before waking from a dream. She told herself it was the wind finding some gap in the old walls. She told herself it was pipes settling, old wood contracting in the evening cool. She told herself several things, standing in that dusty sitting room with her sons pressed close on either side of her, and she didn't fully believe any of them. "Come on," she said, forcing brightness into her voice she didn't feel. "Let's go find bedrooms before it gets dark. We'll figure out the noises tomorrow." But as they climbed the wide staircase, Sarah found herself glancing back, again and again, at the closed door of that sitting room. And she could have sworn, though she never mentioned it to the boys, that just before they turned the corner into the upstairs hall, she heard it again. Not crying this time. A whisper. 2 words, so faint she couldn't be certain she hadn't imagined them entirely. "Find me." The first week at Callaway Manor passed in a haze of exhausted, dust-choked labor. Sarah scrubbed floors until her hands blistered. She and Marcus hauled the rotted porch boards out to a growing pile in the side yard, while Eli, under strict instructions to stay well clear of anything sharp or unstable, collected smaller debris in an old bucket, humming to himself in the particular tuneless way of a child who has decided, against all evidence, that things are going to be okay. They slept, that first week, all 3 together in what had once been the master bedroom, on the second-hand mattress dragged up from the U-Haul, because none of them, though none of them said so out loud, much wanted to be alone in a room by themselves in a house that made the noises this house made at night. Because it did make noises. Sarah told herself, night after night, that old houses settled, that wood contracted and pipes ticked, and wind found its way through gaps a 15-year vacancy would certainly have created. But some of the sounds didn't fit those explanations quite as neatly as she wanted them to. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep in the walls, 3 taps, and then silence, repeating at odd intervals through the night. The occasional creak of floorboards from the empty hallway outside their door. Footsteps, if she let herself think it, though she worked very hard not to. And once, in the deep hours of the 3rd night, she woke to find herself standing at the bedroom window, though she had no memory of getting up, staring out across the moonlit, overgrown grounds toward a small structure at the edge of the property she hadn't yet had the chance to explore, a squat stone building, half swallowed by ivy, that the lawyer's paperwork had identified only as outbuilding, condition unknown. She did not remember walking to the window. She did not remember why, in that moment, she had felt so certain that whatever answers this house was hiding, they were waiting for her there. She told herself it was exhaustion. Sleepwalking, brought on by stress and grief and 4 years of running on empty. She went back to bed and didn't mention it to the boys. It was Marcus who found the second clue, 3 days later, while helping Sarah clear the library of its ruined books. Mom, look at this." He was crouched by the bottom shelf, pulling free a book that, unlike its swollen, water-damaged neighbors, appeared to have survived largely intact. A slim leather journal, its cover worn smooth by handling, tucked into a gap behind the other books as though it had been deliberately hidden there rather than simply shelved. Sarah took it carefully, brushing dust from the cracked leather cover. There was no title. When she opened it, the handwriting inside was small, cramped, and unmistakably old. Pages of careful cursive, dated entries beginning some 40 years earlier. The first entry read, "If anyone ever finds this, know that I did not act out of cruelty. I acted out of fear, and fear makes fools of even the best of us. Forgive me, whoever you are. I was only trying to protect what was left." Sarah's throat went tight. She flipped forward through the pages, catching fragments. Mentions of a trouble with the Hargrove family, references to the deed and what father buried. A repeated phrase, underlined so hard in places the pen had torn the paper. They cannot know. They must never know. Mom. Marcus was watching her face. What is it? What's it say? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted, closing the journal carefully. But I think this house has more secrets than a leaky roof and bad wiring. She didn't sleep well that night. The journal tucked beneath her pillow, its cramped handwriting swimming behind her closed eyes. They cannot know. They must never know. Know what? The knock at the door came 4 days later, sharp and confident, the kind of knock that expected to be answered promptly. Sarah opened it to find a man in an expensive gray suit standing on her half-repaired porch, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, parked at an angle across her drive as if he owned it, sat a black luxury SUV with tinted windows. Mrs. Whitfield? Sarah Whitfield. The man extended a hand she didn't take. Bradley Hargrove. I represent Hargrove Development Group. I believe we're neighbors, in a manner of speaking. My family's land borders yours to the east. Hargrove. The name from the journal landed in her chest like a dropped stone, though she kept her face carefully still. I'm in the middle of unpacking, Mr. Hargrove. Can I help you with something? I'll be brief, he said, though something in his tone suggested he had rehearsed this speech more than once. My family has had an interest in this property for a very long time. Sentimental, mostly, old history between our families, nothing that concerns you. I'd like to make you an offer. A generous one. Cash, no contingencies, closing within 30 days. You could take your boys somewhere with actual opportunity. Somewhere that isn't. His eyes flicked past her, to the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the general air of decay. Somewhere that isn't this. How generous? Sarah asked, because $11 in a Motel 6 room were still fresh enough in her memory that she couldn't afford pride. He named a figure. It was more money than Sarah had ever had in her life, more than she'd earned waitressing in a decade. For one dizzying second, she felt the pull of it, the promise of an apartment with locking doors, of groceries without counting change, of her sons never again asking if there would be pie tonight. But something about the eagerness in his eyes, the speed of the offer, the way he'd shown up within 2 weeks of her arrival, before she'd even finished clearing the first floor, it didn't sit right. Sentimental interest didn't move that fast. Sentimental interest didn't send men in $1,000 suits to knock on doors with cash offers already drawn up in a leather portfolio. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully. But I just got here. I'm not selling anything yet. Something flickered across Bradley Hargrove's face, brief, but unmistakable. Not disappointment. Frustration. The particular frustration of a man and used to hearing no. Think it over, he said, his smile tightening at the edges. The offer won't stay this generous forever, Mrs. Whitfield. Old houses like this, they have a way of costing people more than they're worth. Sometimes it's smarter to walk away before you find out exactly how much. He left without shaking her hand, his SUV kicking up gravel as it pulled away down the long drive, and Sarah stood on her porch for a long time afterward, the journal's underlined words echoing in her mind. They cannot know. They must never know. Whatever secret Margaret Calloway had spent decades protecting, it seemed the Hargrove family had spent just as long trying to get their hands on it. And now, Sarah realized with a slow, cold certainty, so was she. The outbuilding, when Sarah finally worked up the nerve to explore it properly, turned out to be an old carriage house, squat and stone, its heavy wooden doors swollen shut with 15 years of disuse. It took her and Marcus 20 minutes with a crowbar to force one door open enough to slip through. And when they did, the space inside was every bit as choked with dust and shadow as the main house had been. But it was what she found in the back corner, beneath a moth-eaten canvas tarp, that made her breath catch. A large iron strongbox, old and rust-spotted, secured with a heavy padlock that had long since seized with corrosion. "Mom," Marcus breathed, crouching beside her in the dim light filtering through a filthy window. "You think there's something valuable in there?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, running her fingers over the cold metal. "But somebody went to a lot of trouble to hide it out here instead of in the house." It took another hour, a hacksaw borrowed from a neighbor 2 properties down, an elderly woman named Ruth Doyle who'd introduced herself with startled sympathy and a look Sarah couldn't quite decipher, before they finally cut through the padlock shackle and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, was a collection of documents. Deeds. Old surveys, their edges crumbling. A stack of letters bound with disintegrating ribbon. And beneath all of it, folded separately in a stiff leather folio, a single document that made Sarah's hands begin to shake as she read it. A mineral rights deed, dated 1961, granting the Calloway family and their heirs, in perpetuity, full and exclusive rights to a substantial vein of a mineral Sarah had to read the surveyor's report twice to understand. Not gold, not oil, but something the 1960s surveyor's notes described, in cramped technical language, as a rare industrial mineral deposit of exceptional and possibly unprecedented commercial value, located beneath a parcel of land that, according to the accompanying survey map, extended well beyond Calloway Manor's 11 acres, deep into land now claimed and developed by the Hargrove family. Sarah sat back on her heels in the dusty carriage house, the deed trembling in her hands, and understood, in one dizzying rush, exactly why Bradley Hargrove had been so eager to make her a very generous offer, very fast. He wasn't trying to buy a ruined old house. He was trying to buy back a fortune his own family had spent 60 years quietly, illegally, mining out from underneath land they didn't actually own. Ruth Doyle, it turned out, had known Margaret Calloway for 40 years, and once Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask, the old woman was willing to talk. Carefully, in the measured way of someone who had spent a long time keeping quiet out of fear rather than discretion. Margaret's father discovered that mineral back in the 50s, Ruth said, sitting at Sarah's newly scrubbed kitchen table with a cup of tea neither of them had really touched. Filed the rights proper, all legal. But the Hargroves, they've always run this county, one way or another. Judges, sheriffs, half the county council over the years, all beholden to that family somehow. When old man Calloway died and Margaret was left alone out here, the Hargroves started encroaching, little by little. Surveys that came back wrong. Boundary markers that moved in the night. By the time Margaret understood what was happening, they'd already been quietly extracting that mineral for years, hauling it out disguised as ordinary gravel shipments. And there wasn't a judge in this county who'd hear her case against a family that owned half the town. So she just let it happen? Sarah asked, though even as she said it, she thought of the journal, of the pages full of fear and guilt. They cannot know. She fought, for a while, Ruth said. Quietly. She hid the deed, hid the proof, scared they'd find some way to destroy it and erase her claim entirely if she made too much noise. I think, toward the end, she just gave up hoping she'd live to see it made right. But she never sold this land, not once, no matter how many offers came knocking. She held on to that deed for 60 years, waiting for someone she trusted enough to hand it to. Sarah thought of the whisper she'd heard that first night. Find me. She thought of the sitting room, the wall above the fireplace, the crying Eli had sworn he'd heard. There's more here, isn't there? Sarah said slowly. More than just the deed. Ruth's eyes, old and tired and suddenly very sharp, met hers across the table. Margaret always said the truth was hidden closer to home than anyone thought to look. I'd start with that fireplace, if I were you. It took a crowbar, a hammer, and 2 full hours of careful, dust-choked work before Sarah finally found the loose stone above the sitting room's fireplace. A single block of masonry, subtly discolored, that gave way beneath her hands to reveal a shallow cavity behind it. Inside was a small tin box, and inside that, a final letter, the handwriting shakier than in the journal, clearly written much later, much closer to the end. To whoever finally comes home. I am so sorry it took this long. I could not risk this reaching Hargrove hands while I lived alone and unprotected on this land. They would have found a way to make the proof disappear, the way they made so much else disappear over the years. So I waited. I waited for family. I waited for someone with nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for, because it takes exactly that kind of person to stand against a family like the Hargroves. The deed is real. The mineral rights are real and were never legally forfeited, whatever the county records may now claim. There is a second copy of the original 1961 filing at the State Archive in Raleigh. I paid to have it sealed there myself, under a different filing category, so it would survive even if this house did not. Find it. Use it. Do not let them tell you that you are asking for something that was never yours. It was always ours. It is time it finally came home. With love to a family I never got to properly know, but hoped for. Every single day I sat alone in these empty rooms. Margaret. Sarah sat on the dusty floor of the sitting room for a long time after she finished reading, the letter trembling in her hands, her sons watching her with wide, uncertain eyes, waiting to understand whether this was a moment for tears or celebration. It was, she realized slowly, both. The legal fight that followed took the better part of 8 months, and it was, by any measure, the hardest fight of Sarah's life. Harder, in its own way, than 4 years of double shifts and empty refrigerators, because this fight required something she'd never had the luxury of building, the belief that she deserved to win. Gerald Thorne, the lawyer who'd first called her, took the case pro bono once he saw the sealed State Archive filing Sarah tracked down in Raleigh, exactly where Margaret's letter said it would be. And once word got out, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, that Hargrove Development Group had spent 60 years illegally extracting minerals from land they didn't own, other voices began to surface. A retired county surveyor, guilt-ridden, willing finally to testify about falsified boundary reports from decades earlier. A former Hargrove employee, long since fired and bitter, with old shipping manifests he'd kept squirreled away just in case. Bradley Hargrove's generous cash offer, it turned out, had been his family's last, best attempt to make the whole problem quietly go away before anyone thought to check the state archives. When that failed, they lawyered up hard, dragging the case through delay after delay, clearly hoping a single mother with 2 kids and no money would eventually run out of will to fight. She didn't. There were nights, during those 8 months, when Sarah sat up long after the boys were asleep, staring at legal documents she barely understood, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake turning down that first offer, wondering if she was about to lose everything chasing a dead woman's 60-year-old grudge. But then she'd think of Margaret Calloway, alone in this house for 15 years, guarding a truth she never lived to see vindicated, and something in Sarah would harden into resolve. She was not going to let this family's fear win a second time. The settlement, when it finally came, was staggering. A mineral rights payout, back-owed royalties for 60 years of illegal extraction, and a public admission of wrongdoing that made the front page of 3 regional papers. Sarah Whitfield went, almost overnight, from a woman who'd once been evicted with $11 in her pocket to a woman whose name appeared, however briefly and uncomfortably, in headlines about corporate fraud and small-town corruption finally exposed. But headlines were never really the point. The renovation of Calloway Manor took another year, and Sarah oversaw every stage of it herself, walking the halls in a hard hat far too big for her, learning the names of load-bearing walls and the difference between restoration and replacement, insisting, over her contractor's gentle objections, that the original hand-carved fireplace mantel be preserved rather than replaced, that the stained glass window be repaired rather than swapped for something modern and easier. This house had been loved once and abandoned out of fear. She was not going to let either of those things be the last true thing about it. But the fortune, once it finally, truly belonged to her, didn't change Sarah in the way she might once have imagined it would. She bought her sons real beds, yes, and filled the refrigerator, and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time in years, the night she paid off every debt she'd been carrying since David left. But the deepest change was quieter than that, and it took root slowly, the way real change usually does. She thought, often, of that first cold morning at the bus stop, the driver's eyes sliding away, the wave of gray water soaking through her shoes. She thought of Ruth Doyle and the countless other small kindnesses that had carried her further than she'd ever fully acknowledged at the time. And she thought, most of all, of Margaret Calloway, a woman who had spent the last 15 years of her life utterly alone, trusting that someday, someone with nothing left to lose would finally come home and finish what she couldn't. So Sarah did what she suspected Margaret, in some quiet way, had always hoped someone eventually would. She turned half of the restored manor into a transitional shelter for single mothers and their children, women who understood, in the specific and bone-deep way only lived experience can teach, exactly what it meant to be told, again and again, that they didn't deserve enough. She hired Ruth Doyle, over the old woman's flustered protests, as the shelter's first house manager. She funded a scholarship in Margaret Calloway's name for kids in Hollow Creek, who'd grown up the way her own sons briefly had, one crisis away from losing everything. And some evenings, standing on the newly repaired porch as the sun went down gold and orange over the 11 acres she'd once thought worthless, watching Marcus help a new arrival's daughter carry her suitcase up the front steps, while Eli chased fireflies across the lawn with a laugh that no longer carried even a trace of that motel room hush, Sarah would think about the whisper she'd heard that very first night in this house. Find me. She liked to believe, now, that she finally had. Not a fortune, though the fortune had certainly helped. Something more permanent than that. A place where the ones who had been discarded, dismissed, and told they didn't deserve enough could finally, truly come home. The same way she had. Once, on a rainy afternoon with $11 in her pocket and nothing left to lose but the last stubborn ember of hope she hadn't quite managed to let go of. The house remembered her, in the end. And she made sure, for as long as she lived in it, that it would remember everyone else who needed it too.